Welcome to Banyan Books, Branches of Wisdom, celebrating the joy of bright ideas and heartful lifelong learning. Branches of Wisdom is a series of intimate conversations with the world's most influential authors and visionaries. We explore spirituality and the human mind, ecology and culture. Most episodes are recorded with a live audience. You can join our live events and submit questions to your favorite guests. Check out our upcoming schedule at banyan.com. Since 1970, Banyan Books has been a rich oasis at the crossroads of wisdom and philosophy, offering resources for humanity's evolving paths. We're a locally owned, independent bookstore in the heart of Vancouver's Kitsilano neighborhood. Visit us in person or shop online at banyan.com. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews for the podcast. And now, enjoy. Hello and welcome everybody to Branches of Wisdom. I'm your host, Ross McKeechee, and I'm very excited today, really excited for our guest, Mr. Jeff Brown. Before we get to his formal introduction, Banyan Books recognizes that although we have people joining us from all over the world for these live stream events, the physical location of Banyan Books is on the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Most of Banyan's events and podcasts are free. We welcome your donations to keep these programs accessible for all. Just click on the PayPal link in the show description below. Our guest today, Jeff Brown, a former criminal lawyer and psychotherapist. Jeff is the author of 8 popular books, including Soul Shaping, Love It Forward, An Uncommon Bond, Grounded Spirituality, and Hearticulations. He is also the central subject in the award-winning spiritual documentary, Karmageddon. Jeff has authored a series of inspirations for ABC's Good Morning America, and his contributions to other media sources include the Washington Post, Elephant Journal, and Positively Positive. A popular presence in social media, his dictionary of new terms and short, impactful writings became a phenomenon some years ago and continue to be shared by individuals worldwide. His quotes have been shared in social media by Alanis Morissette, Fergie, Jason Silva, Leanne Rimes, and many other well-known figures. Jeff is also the founder of Soul Shaping Institute, his publishing company, Enrealment Press, and host of his own podcast, The Enrealment Hour. Today, Jeff Brown is with Banyan Books in conversation about his new book, Humanifestations, on trauma, truth, and transformation. In Humanifestations, Jeff shares words of courageous and heartfelt wisdom. In his fiercely honest style, he speaks to the challenges of living our truth in this world and supports our efforts to heal and ReBrave. Jeff's writing pierces through spiritual delusions and speaks compassionately to the truth of our human condition, often coining new brilliant phrases in the process. Humanifestations is a revolution of truthspeak that will ignite your power and prepare you to humanifest the life you were born for. If you'd like to learn more about Jeff and his work, you can visit one of his websites. There's soulshapinginstitute.com or jeffbrown.co. Banyan Books community, join me in a very warm welcome for Jeff Brown.
Thank you, Ross.
Hello.
It's really good to be with you. I was getting lonely backstage. No sushi, no people, nothing. No,
Sorry, we ate all the sushi before you got here.
Oh, that's what happened. Isn't that wonderful? Well, we'll have to talk about that. I'm sure I have a quote about that kind of behavior somewhere in this book. No, it's good. It's good to be with Banyan. I really appreciate you're a Canadian national treasure. And as I said earlier when we were talking, you've been a lighthouse that's been holding the space and holding a vision of possibility for humanity over 5 decades. I mean, it's really remarkable, especially in this book market, that you've been able to sustain yourself so beautifully. So I'm grateful for you, and I'm grateful to be here.
Thank you, Jeff. And of course, thanks to the Banyan community for helping to sustain this lighthouse. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jeff, following your work, it's really apparent that you're on a mission, and it seems to be intimately tied to truth and justice. I'm wondering, how would you define your mission, this mission that you're on?
I mean, I think my mission is primarily has been to um, excavate, recognize, and find a way to humanifest my own sacred purpose, my unfolding sacred purpose in this lifetime. I don't think of myself in terms of what I'm trying to do in the world. I think about it in terms of trying to honor that voice and walk that path inside of me. I recognize that on a relational level, um, the messaging is consistent with trying to invite those people who connect with my work to be more sacred purpose driven, to find out what true path is for them, to live in something called truth, to stop dissociating, healing, clearing the debris finally, to recognize who they are and why they're here. Because I do believe that the more we're able to identify and recognize, get out of a sort of a survivalist consciousness that defines who we are by what puts food on the table, and start defining ourselves also in relation to, what James Hillman called the innate image, the idea that we carry an encoded path. I really believe that. And so my work has been to find that within myself, and is to try to find a way to live that as much as possible in a distracting, overwhelming world. And I'm hopeful that it helps people to walk in that direction as well. But I don't I just never really think of it in terms of an external mission. It just feels like it's all emanating from my own need to live inside of my own callings, because that just feels really right and true for me. Yeah.
I watched your documentary Carmageddon,
Oh God,
and
God
yeah.
protect you. Yeah.
No, I found it quite moving and powerful, actually. And
Mm.
Bhagavan Das, of course, is featured. And I listened to some of your recent podcast episode on the Enrealment Hour, where you're speaking with Gavi Strauss
Yeah.
about patriarchal spirituality and the need to diss the body, make the ego the enemy. And
Mm.
there's this kind of tendency to call dissociation really enlightenment. I'm wondering if you can just explain a little bit for us about your journey, where at one time someone like Bhagavan Das was kind of like a mentor figure, teacher figure for you, and then you started questioning and seeing him from a completely different perspective. Can you just talk a bit about that process for you?
Yeah. I mean, I really started as a psychotherapy guy. I was really into the psyche and into emotional process, and did varying amounts of talk therapy at various stages. And then eventually worked my way into somatic psychotherapy. Talk therapy wasn't enough anymore. It was helping me to make sense of things, but it had become kind of redundant. And I think I was strong enough and ready enough to go into my body. And then I looked in the direction of bioenergetics. I read Alexander Lowen's book, Bioenergetics, and joined the training program, and went down to Connecticut a number of times to work with Lowen. And this word spirituality was floating around, but I didn't know what it was. I didn't, and I asked him one time. I said, "Al, what are they talking about?" And he said, in his fantastically, I mean, he was like a wild Mustang. You could really feel so much aliveness coming off his body with a super sharp mind. And I said, "What are they talking about?" And he went, basically, you get inside of your body, I'm paraphrasing, you clear your emotional debris, you get grounded, you reintegrate yourself, and and you become spirited, and that's spirituality. And I was like, yeah, that was exactly the experience I had with him in session. Before session, I would feel sort of dissociated, disconnected. I would clear all this stuff, open, release, and then feel like I was in a unity consciousness experience. Same experience with Stan Groff, who I worked with in holotropic breathwork in the late 90s, I think, early 2000s. So then, I started to read Tolle, and I was like, something's, it's just like that kind of doesn't feel really right to me. Um, I feel like I'm going to sleep. Like he's talking about awakening, and I just felt like this is a sleepening. This is called the new Earth, and I thought this is the new Mars. It didn't feel human to me. It felt like there was a dissociative split between humanness and spirituality. That what they were calling was awakening. Calling awakening seemed to have something to do with getting as far away from your unresolved humanness as possible. And I understood that was what we now call the spiritual bypass, but I understood that that could be a very useful tool, but it didn't make sense to me as a way of being. Like, why was I in a body? Why did I want to develop the healthy ego in psychotherapy? Why did I want to clear my emotional debris? I didn't think my story was an illusion. My story was entirely real. It was living in my cells and tissues. So it did, none of that language made sense. And then I don't know, I think I saw Ram Dass film called Fierce Grace at the University of Toronto. They brought him in after the stroke, and I was so touched by that film. So there was something enticing about this framing of reality. Um, and one thing led to another. I loved Kirtan because Kirtan brought me deeply into my bones. And it took me a long time to realize that what Bhagavan was doing with Kirtan, which was to get out of here, was entirely different from what I was doing with Kirtan, which was to go in here, clear the material so I could be more present in my body. And then I just started to connect with these guys, Ram Dass and Bhagavan, and when you're hanging out with Bhagavan, till you really understand what's going on with these guys, and you're first exposed to it, like when you're first exposed to anything, it's very enticing. When he says, the fire hydrant is God, and you're in that sort of shakti, you're in that energy with him for long enough, you start to get, yeah, the fire hydrant is God, man. It's like you really, it's really kind of a beautiful, expansive kind of Hindu lens on reality. And things do start to happen that make absolute things happen with Bhagavan that make absolutely no sense in the traditional realm. So there's something quite brilliant about it, and there's something quite schizoid about it at the same time, that way of being. And so I just started to hang out with them and allow myself to be enticed. I don't know if I'd call Bhagavan my mentor, but he certainly liked to believe that he was my mentor. But I mean, I was still a grounded Jewish lawyer mind hanging out with this guy. But I allowed myself to just have an experience with him and them, and then it became sort of a Carmageddon became a just like a laboratory for my own expression and expansion. Am I trying to make sense of what they were calling spirituality versus what I was experiencing as spirituality? You have to get drenched in it for a while before it starts to really make sense, and to understand the distinctions between things and the trickery of parts of it, seduction of parts of it, and the brilliance of parts of it. And so by the time we started shooting that film in, I think, like 2004, me and my best friend, two schmucks, had never made a movie in our lives, and apparently like 9 or 10 filmmakers, real filmmakers, had tried to make a movie with him, and they all abandoned the project. But the two Jewish masochists, God forbid we should abandon a project and not complete the things we started. So by 2012, we finally had this movie made. I mean, it was what we had to go through to make that movie is just off the charts. And by the end of it, and I think I captured it in the closing sort of summation as I was walking with Bhagavan, which I'm still touched by, actually. I really began to understand that what they were calling spirituality wasn't spirituality, in my view. It was, people say they're spiritual, but nobody ever asked them what they mean. Um, we don't define spirituality. It's like some kind of sacred cow. And what they were calling spirituality was a bifurcation between spirituality and humanness. So the most spiritual one was the one that was, in a way, the least evolved on a human level, because that was an illusion. Those were misidentifications. That was just your story. That was the worldly. That was the matrix. And it was a very convenient philosophy. I asked a number of them in the making of the film. Men, part of the Neem Karoli Baba community. I call them the Neem team. And I used to ask them questions. I used to say, look, I don't understand it. He keeps saying he's enlightened, but there's some ethical challenges. Let's just put that euphemistically. And I asked Ram Dass that in the film, and because Ram Dass and I became connected, and they all said the same thing except Ramar. They all said, "Oh, enlightenment has nothing to do with morality. It comes to who it comes to." And I thought, well, that's convenient. You don't have to work on any aspect of yourself, and you can call yourself enlightened. And that's fundamental in many ways to patriarchal spiritual structures and what I call the New Age movement. Ram Dass said something different. He said you have to be able to justify yourself, and he said that in the film, I think, on every plane of awareness. And that felt closer, but not close enough for me. And then over the years, just encountering people who got hooked into patriarchal spirituality in the New Age movement, many of whom ended up suiciding because they all fired their therapists and got locked inside of these notions of awakening and had nowhere to turn to in the middle of the night when their unresolved material rose back into their consciousness. It started to become clear to me that what we've been calling spirituality is a very, very dangerous thing, and that we need a new and grounded model for spirituality and a number of embodied, grounded spiritual models going forward so that we can stop confusing dissociation with awakening. Yeah.
It seems to me that one of the dangers, and you do touch on that a bit in the film, and I know you talk about it in your other work too, is that depending on our unresolved trauma, we might be attracted to teachers or gurus that actually can re-traumatize us or recreate similar circumstances. How do you suggest people try and be on the lookout for that?
Well, I think we have a tendency to God objectify somebody. I mean, God is unseen. Our parents disappointed us. Sometimes the guru ends up doing the trick. And I think often the people attracted to the guru are the ones who are also wanting to dissociate from their unresolved material. So they buy into these depersonalized structures and systems. Um, and hopefully, at some point along the way, it serves some kind of a purpose. Maybe it gives them moments of relief or insights into a broader way of understanding reality, which is of value. But then they eventually come back down to earth. Life forces them back down to earth, because we arrived in a body and we're here to experience reality through our body, and we can't get away from it usually for too long before something happens in the relational field at the very least to remind us that we have some stuff that we're carrying and that stuff is incredibly real. And then we either do the work to move in the direction of what I call enrealment, presence as a whole being experience, or we continue to try to perfect singular threads of consciousness while admitting everything that's unresolved and uncomfortable. The guru can play a fantastic role, and some gurus hold the space effectively and beautifully, uh, and people can project what they need to project, feel safe enough to be able to go down into their bodies and actually explore the unresolved material. But as we know, many of them, that's not why they're there. They're there with a very different motivation, and it just ends up leading to all kinds of, I mean, we know what's going on with John DeRuiter in Edmonton, and this is going to start happening over and over again around the world because these systems aren't serving our species any longer, if they ever did at all. And it's time for the great deconstruction of what we've been calling spirituality.
What do you think these teacher-student relationships or these communities might look like when enrealment or embodied spirituality and actually looking at our shadow material is highly in focus?
I think probably more like a kibbutz, more like it's a very good question. There'll be a focus on something like sacred purpose, the idea that everybody comes in with a glorious and meaningful path, a pathway of meaning. And individuation will be emphasized. And instead of moving towards the notion of an absolute selfhood as a point of emphasis, which is sort of barren and equanimous and non-individuated, there will be a lot of focus on helping everybody to find their particular place in the heart of all of this, and there will be an honoring of and a recognition of the fact that we're all trauma survivors, and that this work that's now beginning to take root more deeply around trauma is utterly essential, both because we need to clear emotional debris to be able to even have space inside to excavate and to energize our reasons for being in this lifetime. And also because I think there's an actual real spiritual maturity that happens in the heart of the emotional work. For me, emotional maturity and spiritual maturity are synonymous. So if you don't do that work, you're not going to be able to hold the space for reality. And I define real spirituality as reality. Um, and so the other way, you didn't have to do all that work and call yourself, because to call yourself spiritual, you just had to perfect, become a meditation master or something, and omit every other element of your life. But I think what's happening now, and what will happen, and is starting to slowly happen in communities, is that people are and will gather around a more grounded notion of spirituality, where we move in the direction of honoring every aspect of the human experience as the sacred realm of experience. Yeah.
Jeff, this book, Humanifestations, is very touching and inspiring and reeling, I'll say.
Great.
I'm wondering if you could share with us the opening on page 1 on bravery, where you talk about the 2 forms of courage. Can you share that with us?
Yeah. That's a short one. There are 2 forms of courage in this world. One demands that we jump into action with our armor on. The other demands that we strip ourselves bare naked and surrender. Bravery is a curious thing. Yeah, I don't like all my quotes, but I do like that one, because it was my experience that some part of the transformative process was about adventuring into experience boldly, bravely, what I call depth charges, having experiences, getting information from the experiences as to who you are, why you're here, you know. And some other part of it was not willful at all. It was vulnerable, surrendered, seemingly passive, more integrative, less active, and that both of those wings had to be happening in order to effect the most sustainable amounts of transformation. Yeah. What did that quote mean to you? Why did you pick that quote?
I picked it because to me it pointed to the fact that you talk about survivalist consciousness, and and I love how you give credit to that survivalist consciousness and
Oh,
point to the
yeah.
fact that because of our ancestors' survivalist consciousness and our own, we get to this place where we can shed that armor.
Yeah.
And we can
Where we can have this conversation because of them. I mean, let's face it, Yeah.
Yeah. So
Sorry
that's
to
no, exactly. That's why it was meaningful to me, because it made me appreciate those 2 forms, and that we do need to protect ourselves and create safety before we can take off the armor and be vulnerable with each other.
Absolutely. I mean, this whole war between sort of this notions of conservatism and progressiveness or something is, we know these polarities have been, initiated and intensified primarily through social media algorithms, and they're ridiculous. Certainly as a Canadian, I never thought in my life about who's a liberal or who's a conservative. And I think it's partly because I understand that it's all essential. That survivalistic, practical, armored, emotionally armored consciousness that gets the railroad built in BC and cuts through those mountains. I mean, just get on a train from Calgary to Vancouver and tell me that you don't have gratitude for whoever it was that was able to do that, and that you don't understand why they would have to, particularly in wintry conditions, to have turned off their vulnerability for some period of time in order to get that job done. And just get down on your knees and bow and pray to them for whatever it is they sacrificed unknowingly in their lives in order to build the structures that we call civilization. I mean, seriously. And then let's see where we can go at a progressive level from there. And it's all beautiful. This is all the beautiful part of the human family, and it worries me that we're not understanding that as so-called progressives. There's a sturdiness and a survivalistic tendency, and as climate change is upon us, we're back to a survivalist consciousness. It's not like you can get away from it for too long on this planet. So yeah, I think it's important to be able to hold all of that. Yeah.
Jeff, would you say you're a bit of a romantic at heart?
I often feel like more of a womantic. Yeah, I mean, I wrote an uncommon bond. Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
I get that impression from your work, and it resonates with me. There's something very heartwarming. It also feels true to me, though. It's not a airy-fairy romanticism. I'm wondering, on page 9, there's a piece you wrote that's about intimacy and love, and I that one really touched me.
Do you want to read it?
Sure, I can, unless you, I mean.
I'll read it. Yeah, that's
yeah,
fine.
please.
Yeah, all right.
Please.
Getting close to someone demands that we also get close to ourselves. That's the nature of true intimacy. When our heart opens to another, it also opens to ourselves. Love excavates everything alive within us, including our unresolved shadow, in an effort to bring all that we are into the light of connection. It wants the whole of us to be present for the experience. It wants the whole of us to heal. Then our experience of intimacy is something more than a reach for the other. It's also a reach for ourselves, not merely a fleeting adventure between two souls, but a truly transformative journey towards wholeness. Close quote. Yeah, it's nice. I like that. Aren't we all sort of realizing that now? I mean, it's like roles and functions and duties and all that stuff. Well, that sort of survivalist way of relating that, it served its purpose, but as we evolve, we're recognizing there's some stuff that didn't get attended to, and now we're all, I really believe those of us who are questing for a more authentic way of being relationally, individually, we're pioneers. We are. That's why people are too hard on themselves when they can't make too much progress too quickly, given the human sociology that we're rooted in generationally. And I think it's really showing up in the relational field where, everybody knows the word trigger now. I mean, that 20 years ago, not everybody knew the word trigger. And I think it's becoming important to many of us to use relationship as an opportunity to recognize what we're holding, and also to try to find a way to sustain and deepen relationship by actually doing the work on the material that's coming up.
The one sentence that I marked from that piece was, love excavated everything alive within us, including our unresolved shadow, in an effort to bring all that we are into the light of connection.
Yeah. I can't remember what the quote was. It's in an uncommon bond, where I think the line was, love uncovers, I don't know who wrote it, love uncovers everything unlike itself. And I thought, wow, I really love that, And that's right, because anything profoundly alive and vulnerable then begins to open all of the portals and all the material that we're holding in those trauma tunnels that we carry around with us without recognizing it often when we're on our own, because there's nothing bringing it to the surface. But it's not for the faint of soul. It's not for the faint of heart. This is, this is a really hardcore path to be able to work relationship as an opportunity to become clear on what you're holding, because we're pioneers, we're not just holding from our individual life experience, we're holding an enormity of material generationally that go far back into our lineage, and it's a lot. It's a lot to uncover, and it's a lot to process, and it's a lot to hold, and we're also not trained to accept that we can't work through all of the material because we live in North America and have unrealistic expectations about everything having to happen quickly, and it's not like that. I think if we can just be a generation that recognizes that there's holdings, begins to name the holdings, and find some processes for working through the material, that alone is just an extraordinary achievement, given where humanity has been, I think.
Yeah. You also touch on, I don't have the quote here, but I know you touch on how in relationships, people who are doing psycho-spiritual work can often get stuck in in doing this intense work with someone in a relationship, when maybe the move, the growth comes from peeling away from that relationship. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, so I think it's sort of the distinction between what we could call soulmates, which are connections that are powerful and laden with triggers, but that are forward moving or have the capacity to move forward, grow forward together, and what we could call woundmates, people who are also very emotionally charged together, but for one reason or another, often just the nature of the material or the ways in which their triggers coalesce or don't coalesce in the right direction, end up being attached at the waist. I said in an uncommon bond, waist, WASTE. This is a very complicated thing because people get into sort of the conscious relationship movement and they think, well, that means, well, we're just going to stick it out and keep working the material. And sometimes that is, as you said, that's just not the right move. It's just too disastrous, and it's too combative, and it's just too overwhelmed and flooded with so much ancestral material and individual material. And this is the work to figure out, when it's that or when it's the other. And it's not easy. There's no easy answers.
Yeah. I'd just like to take a moment to remind our live audience that we'll be getting to some of your questions for Jeff in about 10 minutes or so. So please go ahead and type those into the chat or the comments field on YouTube, and we'll get to as many of those as we can.
Let me read your quote.
Please.
I just pulled a quote. I just like this quote. Okay, so it's from page 30 of Humanifestations. Here, I got to do a sales pitch. The brother book to the sister book, Articulations. Okay. There you go. Just thought I'd let you know. Their family, their mishpocha. Okay, here's the quote. Think of your triggers as ghosts from your experiential and ancestral history. They are ghosts who have not yet found their peace. They want to. That's why they keep showing up in your life, but they need your help. They need you to get in close and listen as they share their unresolved past with you. They need you to see them in just the same way you want to be seen. If you keep ignoring them, they won't go away. They will just show up more often. And your life will become a kind of ghost-fulfilling prophecy, one where every choice you make will haunt your days. Perhaps it's time we accepted that we are the haunted house that we fear. In each room, a ghost that is ready to be liberated. In the basement, the unconscious that's ready to be revealed. We don't need to give ourselves candy on Halloween. We just need to give ourselves permission to heal. That's the sweetest gift of all, close quote. Written on Halloween somewhere, some year, way back.
I love it.
Time. Yeah.
Very sweet.
It's a sweet quote. Yeah.
Jeff, a theme that's really important to you, obviously, in your work is justice, and abuse of power is something that you address. On page 25, there's a very impassioned passage there that really jumped off the page for me, about abuse of power. Yeah. And I invite you to read it. I'm happy to take your invitation to read too. So
please read it.
Okay, I'll read it.
Love to hear it.
Okay, so Jeff writes, as I look back on my life, there is one thing I have consistently despised: abuse of power. Abuse of parental power, abuse of economic power, abuse of spiritual power, abuse of political power. I don't care if it comes from the right or the left or the center. Abuse of power is always a crime against humanity. And there is no chance that we will heal the rifts between us or co-create the inclusive world we long for until it becomes extinct. It does show up in so many different areas. I'm wondering.
It's everywhere. Like, I think that, there's obviously identifiable acts that we would call abuse of power, and we have societally, and we're doing more of that, and that's a good thing. but I think it's much more subtle than that. I think it's a particular mindset um, in relation to other that permeates every single part of society and every room we walk into, and most every person we encounter or ourselves at various stages along the way. Um, and I think that it is this dehumanized lens on other, this unhealthily egoic rather than healthily egoic lens on other, this seeing other as prop for your own purposes rather than seeing other as in the same way that you would wish to be seen upon by others. I think that this is really lives at the heart of why our species is in so much trouble. It also permeates our relationships to the environment. Of course, it's the same lens. The environment is a prop for our own purposes, not the earthly home that holds us safe. Um, and I think that there's a way to become healthily egoic, sturdy, sovereign, individuated, which I think is primarily what my work is about. Um, and I think from that sturdy, centered, grounded, developmentally gratified place, not overcompensatory place, um, we arrive at, or we have arrived at, the kind of mentality that's inimical to an abusive power structure. And I think it's very clear. See what's happening, the elites and the power brokers and all the various people, even within families, who benefit from this imbalanced way of interfacing with reality and with other. It's very clear that unless we really, really get subtly inside of an understanding of the distinction between that way of being and a way of being that is truly, truly inclusive, not just inclusive as a diversionary cliche, but inclusivity as a true understanding. And to do that, you have to do a lot of work within your own parts. I mean, inclusivity begins at home, let's face it. And once you do that and begin to accept all of your aspects, it becomes a lot easier and more natural to accept everybody else's. And so often abusers of power in every structure and system are people who are still moving from the overcompensatory egoic structure, the unhealthy ego, the ego we don't want to be moving from. The spiritual community throws the whole ego out with the bathwater, which is utterly ridiculous because then there's no self left to come home to. But so I think that it's important to develop that a healthy ego and understand that what a healthy ego is relationally is one that really honors other as a true equal in all regards. Yeah. So this is really important to me. This particular point of focus. Yeah.
Outside of your experience with Bhagavan Das that we touched on earlier, what has been your experience with these sort of abuses of power, whether it's in spiritual community or you were a lawyer before or in the psychology community? What have you seen or experienced?
That's quite a timely question, Ross. You're an interesting man. I mean, I grew up in an abusive power structure, so I understood it intimately from a very early age, and I was standing down abusive power in my crib, I like to say. I understood it in my time in the criminal law world, for sure. Worked with Eddie Greenspan, articles with Eddie, and learned about abusive power just within the law firm itself. Certainly in the judiciary, certainly in various experiences with law enforcement, and certainly in the spiritual world, and more recently the political world. Let's just say that I understand abuse of power very, very intimately. And I keep coming back. And, as hard as I have tried in my life to get away from it, to find refuge from it, on some archetypal level, and for some reason it just keeps coming back into my life. And I'm not, I suppose, innocent in that. I think there is some archetypal calling to it, because I suppose on some level I'm supposed to do work in this area. And as we see what's happening around us, we spent a lot of time talking about those views and perspectives. I think that we have to wrestle this issue to the ground, and we have to wrestle this issue to the ground very quickly, but I think it's difficult because I think we are primarily an unbraved humanity. I think these systems have been very effective at frightening people, terrifying people, and not empowering people. I think these various systems don't want people to be sovereign and centered, because then they can no longer get away with the abuse of power that we see before us. Yeah.
I didn't realize that that was hitting so close to home for you at this time, but obviously there's been something. Yeah, you hinted in your podcast that you've kind of been through a sort of a personal dark night of the soul over the recent times. So maybe is that related or?
Yes, I'm in it very deeply, and have been mostly every day for the last 2.5 years. Yes, I was connected to some political people and made an effort to get away, and then things happened, and I can't say any more about this at this time, but I it's hitting very, very, very dreadfully, uncomfortably close to home.
Well, our love and best wishes for you to navigate that.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I really appreciate that.
yeah.
And Humanifestations sort of was birthed in the heart of that. I mean, I love doing quotes books when I get enough quotes, but it was partly about like the whole sort of notion of manifestation. Always felt sort of like higher power, or their accomplishments are out of this world. That all felt part of this tendency to dissociate from the wonder of the human experience. And I like the word humanifestations. It's kitschy and silly and all the rest of it, but it feels like it really is consistent with my particular point of focus, which is that we don't need to keep looking up there or something, because we've been so shamed and desacralized and trained to not believe in our own value and the wonder that we are. People often say, we're all little gods in the making, but then they, keep looking away from themselves as gods in the making. So for me, Humanifestations is really about the wonder that is this human experience. And what would it be like if we could just actualize all of our parts and all of our gifts and all of our aspects and offerings and, become really all that we're meant to become and live in the heart of whatever sacred purpose is for us, each as individuals, archetypally and relationally and all the rest of that. And I see a world where nobody ever wants to hurt anybody, because when you're in the heart of your calling, the last thing you ever want to do is hurt anybody. And so to humanifest is to become all that you're meant to become and to bring all that you are to the world itself. And it's my vision of hope for humanity.
It's a wonderful vision. Jeff, we've got some questions coming in from the live audience. There's one here from Sabina, who says, psychologist Daniel Gilbert said that human beings are works in progress that mistakenly think they're finished. How can we make truth and transformation one of our life's guidance systems?
Yeah. Well, by thinking of ourselves as works in process, that would be a good step forward. And I think that by understanding that we come in, whether you believe in past lives or whether you don't. So if you don't, then maybe you sort of believe, if you don't believe in a soul's journey, maybe you believe at least that everybody's born with certain abilities and gifts and talents and callings. And that if we see ourselves as sort of becoming more and more and more who we are over the course of a lifetime, it sort of makes sense that you're probably at this stage of human development where most of us are only accessing a fragment of our possibilities, that this is a lifelong journey. And where you ideally have more and more peace with path on the walking of true path, and fewer of what I call truth aches along the way, which are sort of indicators that you're just alienated from your true path in this lifetime. And more truth chills, that feeling you get when you're speaking truth and living in truth, and to see it as a, Virginia Satir, before she died, was said to have said to Jean Houston, I think, I did what I came here to do. But to take that to a little bit of a broader level, I reached a place where I was doing more of what I came here to do. I think is more realistic and wondrous and beautiful. And if we create a world where that is really beautifully supported, um, I think that would be kind of more aligned with the direction I think that quote is taking us.
Can you talk a little bit? I wanted to ask you about the truth aches. Um, can you talk a little bit about that and how they can help steer us towards living more
Right,
authentically?
right. So if you believe that there is this authenticity-mometer living inside of you, that tells you when you're out of alignment in some part of your life, your relationally or in your working life, and how you're living, whatever you're doing. And in my case, I add the other layer to it, which is what I call sacred purpose. So that it's because I had, I think Jung had a inner daemon or a guiding angel that he named, I think, Philemon, and mine was Little Missy. I wrote about this in Soul Shaping, and Little Missy would interface with the warrior self-identification, how I knew myself to be, and would say, "No, that's not your path." And so we spent many chapters in that book in this conversation. And whenever I would get aligned with my path and be doing what I believed I was meant to do, to what I was here to do, Little Missy would go away. There was no truth ache, and the truth aches would come in very subtle forms, like hints and whispers, something's wrong. Depression, addictive behavior. I mean, anything. Anything can be an indicator of your malaise. And then often people will have what Groff called the spiritual emergency, um, which will be an attempt on some level for the organism to try to push their way through to a life that feels more aligned with who they are. It's messy, it's uncomfortable. They called it a nervous breakdown. If you can go all the way through, we could call that a nervous breakthrough. And so truth aches show up as prompts and as sometimes as very deadly, dangerous, and uncomfortable prompts, because there's some part of us, Maslow called it, I think, grumble theory, that sort of grumbles when we're not moving to the next stage of our own individuation, development, and fulfillment and wholeness. What Philip Shepard called radical wholeness. I think that's true. And then when the truth aches are gone, it means that we're pretty much, for that moment at least, where we're supposed to be in this lifetime. Yeah. So they're your friends, but they're not pleasant. They're aches.
And their counterpart is the truth chills that.
Yeah, that feeling you get, or peace with path, to just to calm it down a little at some point, just to feel like you're moving in the direction of, or you're fulfilling more of what lives deeply within you. What James Hillman called the innate image, which I love that term. There's some encoded truth for you that's living inside of you as to who you are and why you're here. And then, and it doesn't have to be pin you down to a very exactly. You don't have to become an Olympian. It's more archetypal. So for me, it was moving away from just being a warrior and in the direction of being more healing oriented. Let's say it was very clear. Learning how to surrender was a hugely difficult thing for me, and that was part of my growing edge. And now it seems that something's pushing me in the direction of coming back to the warrior, but the benevolent warrior, not the malevolent warrior. So there's an integration between the warrior and the healer. And I think the more you get aligned archetypally and specifically with your directionality, the more peace you've experienced internally and certainly relationally, in your life, because so often so many of the things that happen, so many of the dramas that occur, some of them are to propel you forward, but some of them are an indication that you're living in the heart of a giant truth ache, and everything's just going to keep fucking up until you recognize that you're not on the trajectory that's right for you.
I like that you distinguish that not everybody's true path is something big and grand and flashy. Is that something do people struggle with that sometimes, feeling that they need to be doing something big and public
Yeah.
and
Yeah, it's a terrible prison to be in, because first of all, many of the people nowadays who become publicly known are, it's not a meritocracy. They're just good at manipulating imagery. I mean, this is just optics and nonsense, and it's Meghan and Harry, and it's like none of these people are remotely interesting to me. So I think, first of all, in order to get there in this world, for the most part, you have to have not a whole lot to you, but you have to be really good at looking like there's something interesting about you. I mean, Kardashians are just the beginning of the conversation. But I also think that if you get really inside of the soul's journey, it's a very private and very subtle and very individuated path. And I think that it's celebrity culture. Oprah win. I mean, who knows if Oprah is even walking her true path? I don't know that. Eddie Greenspan was the most profoundly famous criminal lawyer in Canadian history. We'd walk along Queen Street in Toronto and he'd say, I don't think I should be doing this. So, so I knew this guy on High Park in Toronto. He would go and feed the birds. And he said, man, I'm clear as a bell that this is why I'm here in this lifetime. And who am I to argue with him? Man was so at peace with himself in that experience. So I think that if we're going to really take the soul's journey seriously and not the bullshit culture seriously, then it has nothing to do with, for most people, and luckily, because who wants to live in the heart of that projected field? It has nothing to do with fame and fortune. It has to do with the true fortune, right? The true richness of life, which is finding out who you are and why you're here, whatever that looks like, and knowing from your own indicators within yourself, truth aches versus truth chills, to simplify it, that you're walking in the right direction, that this is the tapestry that you're here to craft. And I just think that, public, I mean, the interesting thing about power and all these things is that the people who want it are the people who have yet to find deep gratification within themselves, because the people who do, they want nothing to do with that nonsense because they know what that is. And this is our cultural problem. People end up in power who shouldn't be in power, and the ones who could handle power don't want anything to do with it. Because what happened for the latter group of people is they have found their true mission at the heart of their soul's journey, and it's really real for them. It's really real for them, and they're the luckiest people on earth, in my opinion. Yeah.
There's a question here from John. He's asking, are you hopeful for the evolution of enrealment and grounded spirituality?
I was in 2019. I was so excited to write that for stinking a book. I mean, it was so intense. It's like 400 pages of just like intensity. Yes, I'm hopeful, but not quite as hopeful. And this may have something to do with the experience I've been in, that have become a little bit more pessimistic about the direction of humanity, and I acknowledge that. And my prayer is that I reach a place where I regain my optimism. But I also feel as though, I think that the work that's happening around trauma and somatic psychotherapy in particular is, for me, about enrealment and grounded spirituality. It really is. There are some dissociative versions of this stuff, and some of it's being sort of, I think, given more credit than it should be given. But I think that is the direction: down into the body, down into the feet, down into the trauma tunnels, recognition of what we're holding, normalizing language about that, clearing emotional debris, learning various methods and tools depending on how someone's organized and how their nervous system is organized. And so I think that's the step forward. AI terrifies me in terms of the movement, obviously, in that direction. And, the way in which we're going to interface with climate change is concerning. My concern is that we've just fucked it up too bad. I mean, listen, we've been here for what, thousands, millions of years, and we're only now starting to acknowledge trauma and talk about authentic relating. Like, what have we been doing all this time? Like, seriously, what the fuck have we been doing? And I'm sorry to be so blunt about it, but I say that all the time. It's like, is it too late? Or is it not too late? And the kids give me hope. I mean, they gave me hope because they see through the man, they see through the system. They absolutely can't stand mainstream media. They're like, oh my God, those old white men and their materialistic shtick. But so many of them are having a hard time staying here now. The suicide rates are off the charts for kids. And They are, and I just did with Gubby Strauss, and it's going to go up in the next week, another in Real Matter. We talked about this issue of how to inspire these kids to understand that we need them desperately right now. Even those of us who have a progressive perspective on healing and transformation and human development, we're still conditioned in the old system. And these young people have a different lens. If we could just find a way to help them understand how desperately needed they are right now in order to help us to figure out how to craft the world of sacred possibility that we know is absolutely possible, but that seems sometimes to be getting farther and farther away from us.
Jeff, what are the things, I shouldn't just say what are, but first, are there things? And if so, what are the things from more traditional structures that you still feel are valuable?
Well, I think the rule of law, if it's taken seriously, is absolutely valuable. I think charters of rights and freedoms are wonderful progressive things. And I think broadening rule of law to encompass our more inclusive realizations about humanity is beautiful, wonderful. I think the problem is that in many cases, these things are props. They're presentations, they're optics, they're illusions, they're optical illusions that, in my view and in my experience, are not actually taken seriously when it really matters. So I think that something has to happen to bridge the gap between the seeming and the reality of things. And I think that has to happen on a grassroots level. I think that, I think the movement towards a whistleblower world where we support whistleblowers I think that may be ultimately our only hope, because I think in the way in which this is organized, the divide between the so-called elites or the power brokers and most of humanity is getting wider and wider. And at some point, it may be, particularly with the use of technology and AI, it may become impossible for us to bridge the gap. So, the moment is now, I think, for us to really take action. And I'm not as optimistic as I once was about our willingness to do that, or us being in a condition needed for us to do that.
So
we need more Banyan-like communities, but like super grounded, no bullshit nicks that are just like ready to go for it.
Right.
Right? Like heartfelt intention, benevolently intended communities like yours, but like super solid, super clear, super supportive, and like not going to stop until they craft that world of sacred possibility.
So what would you say? I mean, you were just speaking to young people and how needed they are. In terms of action for youth, what's one thing, what's the biggest thing you think they can do right now? Is it having a voice? Is it what?
It's absolutely having a voice. And it's gathering together. It's unifying. I think numbers are everything in this world, let's face it. And I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about people, numbers of people. And I think they need to band together. And I think we need to do it in community, in smaller and larger communities. And we have to name a list together, agree upon in every community a list of issues in society that we think are really, really important and really pressing and really imperative, and that we're really terrified to focus on. And I think we need to get to it and support one another and support whistleblowers and make things happen on a very, very real level. I think we have to take it to a more revolutionary level. I'm not talking about violence. I don't advocate for violence. But we have to take it to a much more activated and revolutionary level, or we're going to be so surveyed and so hemmed in and so smartphone manipulated and so distracted that we're not even going to notice, that the world is burning. There was this John Cusack movie. It was called like 2012, or do you remember that movie that came out? It was like,
Yeah.
Right. So there was this poster image for the movie that had a bunch of sort of Tibetan monks or something on the top of a mountain in sort of meditative repose, as though they had found nirvana in their dissociation from the world. It's easy to find nirvana when you dissociate from the world, but and then you could see the water coming over the mountain to kill them. It was like, here comes reality, baby. Let's see where your nirvana takes. So now I think, so at that time I was focusing on that perspective in the spiritual community, on patriarchal spirituality. But now I see that being the case for all of us. Once we got addicted to these fucking phones, they had us. They have us by the smartphones. And I think we need to find a way to ground ourselves and to really recognize the way we're being manipulated. And then to do something about it, to figure out what fills that now empty space with meaning and purpose and directionality rather than distraction, and then craft the world from that consciousness.
Well, there's so many more avenues I would love to go down with you, Jeff, but we're just coming to our time, and I'd love to, just bookmark that for the future to continue our conversation sometime.
Anytime.
Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been speaking to Jeff Brown. His latest book is Humanifestations on Trauma, Truth, and Transformation. Of course, you can get it at banyan.com or visit us in person. Jeff, big applause for your work and everything that you're doing, and much gratitude for you taking the time to speak with us today.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Ross. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for joining us for Branches of Wisdom, a podcast of Banyan Books and Sound, Canada's spiritual and healing resource since 1970. Our podcast producer is Jacob Steele. The show is edited by Abdo Habani. Watch all our conversations on YouTube by searching for Banyan Books, or listen on your favorite podcast platform. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews and comments. We love to hear from you. For all our live events, books, and more, visit us at banyan.com.